When application completion rates drop, something is off. Students aren't getting the support they need, and that's affecting your numbers. Enter Element 451's AI assistants. They step in where students struggle, offering real-time answers and advice, guiding them through every step. Learn how AI assistants can boost your enrollment outcomes. Visit element451.com/AI team to learn more.
There's an organization called WebAIM that surveys over 1 million sites. I think the 2024 report was 95% of these websites had a WCAG problem and error.
Welcome to the EduData Podcast, a podcast that serves as your weekly guide to the data driving higher education. We are your hosts. I'm Jamie Boggs.
And I'm Timothy Davis. Join us every Friday for weekly breakdowns of the most important data, trends, and topics in higher education.
The EduData Podcast is a part of the Enrollify network, a robust collection of podcasts designed to help higher education professionals like you grow. Explore our other shows at enrollify.org or check out some of my personal favorites, linked in the show notes below.
Enrollify is made possible by Element 451, the leading AI-powered, all-in-one student engagement platform, helping institutions create meaningful, personalized, and engaging interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the EduData Podcast. I'm Timothy Davis. Thank you so much for joining us today. Hey, if you're just seeing this episode on maybe LinkedIn or on wherever you get your podcasts, hop over to our LinkedIn post on the Enrollify page and give us a comment. Let us know your thoughts on the episode. Today, we're going to be talking about accessibility, and I'm joined today by Eugene Wu, CEO at Venngage. Hey, Eugene, how are we doing today?
I'm great. Thanks a lot for that introduction, Timothy.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. Do you want to start by telling us a little bit about yourself and about your work at Venngage?
Sure. I'm the CEO of Venngage, and Venngage is a design platform or a design tool. It's very similar to Canva, with one big exception. We have a main focus on accessibility and on creating accessible documents and PDFs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm excited to talk to you today because in higher ed, I think everybody is kind of peripherally aware, at least, of accessibility, especially on the academic side. There might be one or two point people in a given institution or even maybe by department that are really focused on accessibility and ensuring that documents are accessible, but their work is very specialized and they have specialized knowledge where everybody else, especially on the academic side and especially on the admissions and marketing side, everyone's just kind of aware of it, but does not have a huge grasp of the specialized skill sets that are involved in that and the considerations and the data that's involved. And so I'm excited to talk to you and get a little bit more perspective on that. So would you start by kind of giving us an introduction to what accessibility entails? What's kind of our scope here and what does that look like?
Sure. I can give a very kind of high level overview. And I think to your point, yes, academia may know a little bit of accessibility, but once you go outside of that, it becomes less and less, well known. So when we talk about accessibility, we are talking about, making your content or making, and that involves, for the most part, websites, courses, any documents that you have that a university or higher ed education has on their website, making that accessible to everyone, and particularly people with disabilities. So there are certain standards and formats that sort of dictate how your website, how your document should look like or be formatted so that it's accessible. And when we mean accessible, we mean, I think the most simple way is looking at screen readers. Not everyone consumes a content by looking at it visually and reading it like you and I do. Some people may have to access a website or a document via a screen reader, for example, or choose some sort of assistive technology that has like a voiceover. I think those are the most simple things that everyone can understand. You can voice over a website. You don't have to look at it, but you can understand the content on the website. And in order for that screen reader or the assistive technology to work, your website and your content has to be formatted in a specific manner. And there are regulations that kind of dictate how and what that format looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. So talk a little bit about some of those regulations that dictate what's kind of in play here. Some of it is at the federal level, some of it may be at the state level. Other is just sort of best practice in the industry.
Yeah, I think before we go into that, since this is about data, I can give you like some high level data on like
Oh
why is
yeah.
this important? Like why is this a problem in the first place, right? Like most people probably don't know how big of a problem this
Hmm.
is. So if you look at the very high level stats, the CDC has a report that says that 1 out of 4 US adults have some form of disability. And if you look at WHO data, they put at 15% of the global population have some sort of disability. And this doesn't include, sort of like temporary disabilities, like you got injured and, you for some reason can't use the mouse, for example, and you have to use, like your keyboard or something else to access the event. So it doesn't even count temporary disabilities, which, if you add all of that in, that number is probably a lot bigger. So it's quite a big problem. If you're talking about 1 out of 4, it's like, 25% of the population have some sort of disability and may have barriers to consuming whatever content a university has on their website. And when you look at university websites in general, or websites in general, let's not just focus on universities. Websites in general, you may ask, are most websites accessible by the standards? And the standard that covers this is WCAG or WCAG, which is a short form, the WCAG 2.1 or 2.2 standards. What is the percentage of websites that actually conform to that? It's a very small percent, I think. There's an organization called WebAIM that surveys over 1 million sites. I think the 2024 report was 95% of these websites had a WCAG problem and error. Now it's easy to have an error, like most websites, as have an error, have errors. But if you kind of look at what are the, so going into answer your question, like you go in, what are some of the problems or issues that most people have? The most common is low contrast, which means that you have text that has very low contrast against the background. So you cannot read it if it's either too light on a light background or a very dark text on a dark background. So according to I'm reading the stats now, WebAIM stats, like 81% of home pages have a low contrast problem. And that is something that's very fixable. You can obviously check the color. You can check the color contrast. There's lots of tools that checks color contrast and comply very easily. And sometimes you can just look at a website and go, wow, but I can barely read it. The colors, it's like a yellow, overlay on a red background. Something like some of them are actually pretty obvious, but some of them are not, right? Depending on how good your eyesight is. So that's number one. Number two is alt text. So alt text essentially is alternative text for images. If you're trying to read an image, you are reading the alt text that describes that image. And according to WebAIM, over 54% of pages either don't have the alt text, or basically they hinder the screen reader from assessing the alt text. So that means that most of the visual content is lost or cannot be read by people who are using screen readers, for example. And then there's things like tagging and input labels on forms. So forms is a huge problem for someone who is using a screen reader or keyboard to access a form. A lot of forms aren't formatted properly. So if you're trying to fill in, whether it's admissions or whatever it is, a simple like questionnaire, a lot of people may not be able to even fill out that form because either the input fields are not formatted properly, or they have different labels, or they don't know what they're filling out. And those are things that are, again, very common, or like 50% of forms doesn't have proper labels. Yeah, and then there's a whole bunch of stuff on links and buttons, how they should be formatted so that if I'm someone navigating the site with a screen reader, I can, I'll know what the button means because it has a good description. I'll know where this link is taking me to, instead of, very common is people don't put essentially descriptive things on their links. They'll just say something like, click here. And, I don't know what I'm clicking at, right? Things like that are not very descriptive, as opposed to apply now or submit your applications, where it's much more descriptive, and someone using a screen reader or something like VoiceOver can understand what they're actually trying to do. So that's like a very high level things on like what the problems are and some of the stats on how websites fare as far as accessibility is concerned.
Yeah, I actually worked on websites on campus before moving to my current role at Element. And just from my experience, like accessibility was like a tertiary concern usually, which, and some institutions are much better. Some institutions have found a way to emphasize that, or in their, website redesigns have found a way to emphasize that and build from the ground up the conformity of their website to accessibility standards. But that was not the case at the institution I was at. And, it gets kind of tricky because like you want to do, you mentioned like color contrast, but you start with your brand colors. Okay. Well, if your brand colors don't have good contrast against, white or black text, like you're kind of up a creek, because you got to go all the way back up to the brand level and design for accessibility. So not something that I got to see to fruition at the institution I started my career at, but certainly something that should be on people's radars. This can be something that really has lasting impacts. And so you kind of talked about, some of the really highly visible ones like screen readers, and I have another funny story about screen readers is the person who was kind of in charge of accessibility on the academic side for our LMS, our learning management system, also kind of took an interest in the website and making sure that like degree programs were accessible and people could find that information, and showed me like what a screen reader sort of sounds like. And I'd never encountered that, and I'm like 22 at this point, like a kid. Never encountered that. And they start reading this page, and it's going really fast. If you've never heard a screen reader, you can see them on like YouTube. They're really interesting how they work. They read really fast, and you just get adapted to like that 3x speed of reading through a web page. But then you come to a image, and it's program, and then like student 1 at table in conference room.jpg. Rattles off, and it's like, why is that relevant at all? Until to a person without visual impairments, you see like, oh, they're working on their homework or whatever, but the descriptive text for that image is not there, so the person using a screen reader has no concept of what that kind of entails and what they're supposed to be perceiving as part of this web page. But screen readers are not the only ones. You talked a little bit in our initial conversation about how, just like plain language and reading level is also a consideration for accessibility. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, especially in I would say in academia, there are lots of people who do not read at the same level as an academic. I think the vast majority of the population do not read at the same level as someone in the faculty. And I think oftentimes when they're tasked to write, this is like a very specific problem to universities. They're tasked to write like what the program entails, what's in the course, or what's in the program. Like it becomes, either it's full of jargon, it's all academic speak. If you read an academic journal or an academic article, it's very, very hard to understand. So writing or even speaking is communicating in plain language. And when I mean plain language, essentially language that's easy to understand. And if you use, like a writing tool like Hemingway, it will actually tell you like, hey, your writing is at a 7th grade level, or 6th grade level, or an academic, PhD level. I don't know if they have that level. And it kind of tells you how accessible your writing is. And I think, unfortunately, for academics, they're used to writing at a certain level for academic journals and their peers, and they forget that. And when they write for, basically high school students and their parents, that content is not accessible because, not just because of the grade levels. And there's also, people with cognitive and, disabilities who have a harder time understanding very complicated text. And I think thankfully now with a lot of the AI tools, you can actually very easily take your very complicated text. And I tell people to do that, like just check your copy, just put it in whatever ChatGPT or whatever tool that you use, or even Hemingway, and then have it edited to a more plain language. You can literally use the prompt, can you edit this into a plain language, or use plain language, and then it will change all your jargons and your complicated words into like more easy to understand and more straightforward and direct sentences.
Yeah. That dichotomy of like not writing in academic language, writing for, direct information transfer is one of the oldest tropes in like higher ed marketing and admissions. And everybody who works in marketing and admissions has had that exact argument with an academic. And like on the academic side, they're like, well, look, we got to sound like we're for real. Like if we start writing in this simple language, people are gonna be like, "This guy's got a PhD," you know. So like, so it's definitely a trade off there, but it absolutely is an accessibility concern. You kind of talked about like some of the different things you can check your website for, alt text, color contrast, and then also this plain language, some of the standards that you can sort of work towards. How can listeners today who are maybe just encountering this topic for the first time or kind of hearing about this for the first time, how can they check their website or their content and get some actual data about like what the scope of accessibility problems may be, the impact of accessibility on their website may look like?
Yeah, so they are a lot of like tools you can, like simple tools you can just check that. I would say these would be the first level check. So there's a tool, there's a Google Lighthouse tool, which I think a lot of web developers use for many, many things, but it also has an accessibility checker in there. I think that's the problem for someone actually, building a website or kind of using a website. The Lighthouse plugin, it's like an extension of your browser. It's probably the easiest, and you can it gives you a score and it gives you problems, like what are the sorts of problems you may have on your website. And then I would say after that, if you want to dive in even deeper, you can install a more specific tool, a more like accessibility specific tool that checks the WCAG compliant, and that's Wave or X. You can just Google that, Wave or X. And those are made by, fairly, I would say, they're fairly well-known tools out there that you can just, run. It's what we call like a static checker. It just checks your website for the most obvious problems in your code. And it'll give you a score. It'll give you, like errors on like, hey, your text, your links are not descriptive, your buttons are, not descriptive, or the forms have no labels, and it'll give you those kinds of errors that are, I would say, the first level, pretty easy to fix things. Then we move on to the next level. So if you want to say like, wow, I really want to look at other things, then there's obviously actual testing, accessibility testing, and that requires some skill. So if you're not someone who has done accessibility testing, that will require you to use, an assistive technology like a screen reader, or you would, actually get somebody who is, a native screen reader user to go through your website. And that's where you may find things that are not obvious that these automated checkers won't flag. Things that are like, the plain language thing, for example, is something that probably it won't flag that. It won't flag navigation issues if you've got like these what we call navigation traps, where you are navigating a website and then you just keep going into a loop, or like just weird things on the site that you and I, like some people may take for granted. And for example, because this is a common example before, it's much less now. The cookie pop-up, for example, that all websites now have. A lot of times those are at the bottom of the screen, and you would have to traverse the entire content to get rid of it, right? Mm-hmm. If not, it's always there. And so it's very hard to, it may be like a click of a button for someone using a mouse, but for someone not using a mouse, they may have to go through like hundreds and hundreds of pages before they can, or navigating hundreds and hundreds of steps before they can get rid of that. So things like that you can only kind of identify with, testing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so basically the screen reader is going to start at the top of the website document, the HTML document, and read top to bottom what it entails, right? So you're talking about if that cookie button is in line of the HTML document at the bottom or in the footer, they're going to have to go the entirety of the header and then the body of the page. And if this is, a super deep page, they're going to be listening to this thing for a long time just to hear at the end that they've, got to clear through this cookie capture or whatever. So
that's really if you don't have your navigation set up properly, like obviously if you have it set up so that you can just, skip, you have these landmarks, you can just skip to different parts of the website quickly. Or if you have your header set up so you're not forcing someone to go top to bottom, they can just skip to the important things, or they can just tab through, and the first few tabs is essentially you hit the cookie thing that you need to get rid of quickly, right? So again, it's all on that's all on navigation. You can figure that in a way that someone using a screen reader can access these different things very, very quickly. But if you don't, if you just kind of go by default, there's no navigation, there's nothing, then you may be forcing or trapping your users, in your website.
Getting them kind of in a loop or in a place where they can't really advance. So obviously, well, it's really cool that you can like get to an accessibility checker tool fairly simply. There's some websites out there where you just kind of copy your website domain and pop it into the search bar or whatever, and it runs that checker for you. Or if you've ever used a Chrome browser or like Edge browser extension, they have like an extension store and you can go download. Lighthouse was one of the ones that you mentioned. There's some other ones, but basically just like anything at the accessibility checker, search query result, whatever that may be. So that's really cool that getting started is that simple. But it'd be nice if we could kind of take care of this at the onset. I talked about that story of like accessibility was like the third concern. We design the whole thing and then we're like, oh shoot, we've got 15 problems. You got to put out all these fires now. But at Venngage, you guys have kind of built that into the process of design. So do you want to talk about like what Venngage does and how you've built it with accessibility in mind?
Sure. Yeah. I think to your point, the status quo right now is to treat it as the third. It's at the end. Basically, it's a very reactive endeavor, right? It's reactive. So, and I hate to say this, but usually, like even higher ed, they either react when they get sued, or they get an OCR complaint, which is the Office of Civil Rights complaint, the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights complaint. The OCR handles complaints that has to do with civil rights, and ADA kind of falls into that jurisdiction. And so usually it's reactive, right? Like you said, they don't really care about it, or they're not looking into it until they get a complaint or they get sued. And there have been lots of cases until recently. I think that but I think in 2022 there were over 6,000 OCR complaints, and so these are all educational institutions, and I think it includes K-12 as well, not just higher ed. Mm-hmm. But that's a lot. Like it's over 6,000 complaints. So the status quo is that, right? You kind of look at it at the end, or you only look at it when you get sued or you get a complaint by OCR. And the problem with that process is it's a lot more work to redo everything, right? So it usually results in redo. So in our case, in Venngage, like we deal mainly with documents. We don't create websites, and so we deal with mainly, we think documents like could be an educational document, some handouts, flyers, infographics. Even presentation handouts. We deal with things that are for the most part PDFs, because they're exported as a PDF. And the status quo of that is, for the most part, if you're using any other tool except for Venngage, you would take that PDF and then you would have to send it to a professional, what we call a PDF remediator, essentially someone who is who knows a lot about accessibility, and they have to then fix the PDF, and they're literally going into Adobe Acrobat and fixing the structure and essentially putting in all the things we talked about, like the alt text, putting in the heading structure, sometimes fixing the reading order and whatever else that's wrong with that document. So what Venngage has done is that it's allowed the user, the creator of the document or the design, to do all of that up front. So, there's a whole thing called shift left. I'm not talking about political left. I'm talking about shifting accessibility up front in the process, being more proactive. And that's what we've done with Venngage. So with Venngage, you can design a document, you can design an infographic, a presentation, a flyer in an accessible way right from the start. And then you can export a PDF that's accessible. And if you've done it correctly, you don't have to send it to, the accessibility or the accommodations office to kind of fix or remediate that PDF.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like, again, moving it up in the process so you don't have to go back and fix it later. But I think there's a lot of use cases in higher ed where PDFs are still very much in play. On the academic side, you're talking about, syllabus, transcripts, right? Those are potentially options there. But even on like the marketing and admission side, they're making flyers all the time. They're making social media graphics. Sometimes, obviously, that wouldn't have the same concerns as a PDF. But like if you're printing anything, there you go. There's your option. And if you're sending out a PDF, to students about X, Y, or Z that you're recruiting them for, there you go. There's a lot of potential use cases there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's used in recruiting, and a lot of Marcom. They use design tools. And they create a lot of PDFs. And for the most part, if you're, I hate to name names, but if you're using something like a Canva or even Adobe Express, you will find that you will need to remediate that document if you want it to be accessible, right? And for the most part, people don't do that. So they just kind of post it and then they're not accessible. and then they may get into trouble, and they will get into trouble soon. There is a deadline. There's an ADA Title II deadline that's coming up in a year and a half, in 2026, which, depending on the size of your institution, public institutions, you will need to comply with. And for the most part, that means your documents and websites need to be, and courses and everything else that a student needs to consume has to be accessible.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, well, hey, thank you so much for talking to us about this topic today. This is really interesting and something that I think everybody just needs a little bit more information on. Where can people find you and find Venngage?
Sure. I mean, I'm active on LinkedIn. If you just, hopefully, I don't know how many Eugene Boos, if you do and search for me, but you probably find me. And then Venngage, obviously Venngage.com. That's Venngage. It's two ends, like a Venn diagram. And that's the best place to check us out.
Okay. Yeah. Well, your information will be linked down in the show notes below, as will some of the resources that we talked about, like that CDC study. But for that, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up today. Thank you so much for being here, Eugene. It was great to talk to you today. Thank you all for joining us. Have a great rest of your day and enjoy that weekend. All right. See you in the next one.
The EduData podcast is part of the Enrollify podcast network. If you like this podcast, chances are you'll like the other Enrollify shows too. Our podcast network is growing by the month. We've got a plethora of marketing, enrollment, and higher ed technology shows that are jam-packed with stories, ideas, and frameworks, all designed to empower you to be a better higher ed professional.
Our shows help higher ed marketers and admissions professionals find their next big idea and feature a selection of the industry's best as your hosts. Learn from Jamie Hunt, Artis Cadu, Dustin Ramsdale, Jeremy Tiers, and so many of your other favorite leaders in higher ed. Enrollify is made possible by Element 451, the leading AI-powered all-in-one student engagement platform helping institutions create meaningful, personalized, and engaging interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com.